Gödel's logical proof of God's existence depends on religious assumptions. Kurt Gödel's proof of God's existence may well work logically. Indeed, it may even be logically flawless. However, it doesn't actually prove that God exists. Instead, it proves that affent, the axioms are taken to be true, consent, we must conclude that God exists. Paul Austin Murphy, 8 minutes, read on August 15, 2024. 8. Zoom image will be displayed. Introduction. T. The philosophy and metalogic of Gödel's proof. Things logically follow from false and absurd axioms. V. Is Gödel's proof a language game? V. Gödel's theological proof? Vi. Conclusion. Gödel's 14 points. The first version of Kurt Gödel's ontological proof of God's existence dates back to 1941. However, Gödel didn't tell anyone about it until 1970, when he believed he was dying. It's not entirely clear why Gödel kept his proof to himself. One commentator wrote the following words: "The shy Gödel feared ridicule. He probably told Einstein about his God proof, but he told nobody else until 1970, and he never went public. And in 1970, the German mathematical economist Oskar Morgenstern wrote in his diary that Gödel wouldn't publish his proof because he was afraid that other people may think that he actually believes in God." Despite Morgenstern's words, it's clear that Gödel believed in both God and the afterlife long before he constructed his ontological proof. Indeed, he actually argued in detail that people should believe in an afterlife. See here. Moreover, the Chinese-American logician and mathematician Hao Wang stated in his book A Logical Journey from Gödel to Philosophy that Gödel's wife Adele said that Gödel, although he did not go to church, was religious and read the Bible in bed every Sunday morning. What did Gödel himself say? In an answer to a questionnaire, Gödel described his religion as baptized Lutheran. He also went on to say that he wasn't a member of any religious congregation. Gödel continued, "My belief is theistic, not pantheistic, following Leibniz rather than Spinoza." The philosophy and metalogic of Gödel's proof. It's quite incredible that Gödel provided no arguments as to why the axioms in his ontological argument are true. It seems that he must have taken them to be true primarily because they belong to a long and venerable philosophical tradition of ontological arguments. This tradition involved the philosophers Anselm, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, and many others. See here. Since Gödel's axioms aren't argued for, then their embedded terms can be seen to be arbitrary. Indeed, they can even be seen as logical placeholders. Here's some of those embedded terms and axioms. Godlike, positive property. A godlike object exists in every possible world. The property of being godlike is positive, and God, by definition, is that for which no greater can be conceived. The Australian philosopher Graham Oppy picked up on all this. He argued that many other almost gods would also be proven through Gödel's axioms. In other words, if the axioms referred to almost gods rather than to God, then their existence would also be proven using Gödel's very own logico-theological or theological system. Similarly, the theoretical physicist Manon Bischoff writes, A's logicians have shown it is possible to construct cases where, by Gödel's definition, there are more than 700 divine entities that differ in essence. In terms of the logic of logical systems, things logically follow from false and absurd axioms. Zoom image will be displayed. From the axiom that, to take just one example, God, by definition, is that for which no greater can be conceived. All sorts of things follow, in simple terms. In logic, if the axioms or premises are taken to be true or simply accepted as they stand, then all sorts of things will follow from them. Indeed, this is why there's a metalogical distinction made between sound and valid arguments. See here, as one writer put it, a proof does not necessitate that the conclusion be correct, but rather that by accepting the axioms, the conclusion follows logically. That sentence summarizes the point being made here. However, I would dispute the use of the word correct. That's because we should really have the following statement. A proof does not necessitate that the conclusion be true, unless of course this writer is simply using the word correct as a synonym for the word true. In detail. It's usually the case that the moves in a logical argument, or in a proof, are said to be correct, whereas its premises if not axioms, can be taken to be or actually are true or false. Thus, conclusions still follow logically from false premises or axioms. In Gödel's case, perhaps, conclusions still follow from false. For example, Napoleon is alive, or even absurd, for example, the number 4 is happy axioms. Let's now discuss Gödel's proof or system from a broader metalogical and philosophical point of view. Is Gödel's proof a language game? Zoom image will be displayed. Perhaps Gödel's proof constitutes a Wittgensteinian language game. The term language game is used here because all the terms and arguments within Gödel's ontological proof mutually reinforce each other. Relevantly, that's without them necessarily having any meaning or relevance to anything on the outside of the actual system or game. Take Wittgenstein's discussion of the liar paradox. Paradoxes like the liar were seen, by Wittgenstein, to arise within various language games. At first glance, then, Wittgenstein was perfectly correct to use the philosophical term his own language game to refer to the liar paradox. To add to Wittgenstein himself, the liar paradox as treated by Gödel and others is internal to a language game which allows a very specific and very odd kind of self-reference. But, again, why use the term language game here? Well, in which other language would you ever find the seemingly empty statement, "This sentence is false"? Indeed, even its supposed everyday translation, "I am a liar," seems somewhat contrived. Now compare "this sentence is false" to Gödel's own. The property of being godlike is positive, or to a godlike object exists in every possible world. Thus, these kinds of sentence simply don't belong to everyday languages at all. They all belong to specific, technical language games. More specifically, if these statements, for example, "this sentence is false" and "the property of being godlike is positive," are scientifically and empirically empty, then perhaps we really don't need to worry about the possibility of Gödel's faulty circularity. Of course, logicians can, and do, use weirder statements such as "bricks have a sense of humor" or "the number 2 is blue" logically. That is, they can assign a truth value to such statements, and then treat them as pure syntactic strings from which they can derive further statements and conclusions. Similarly, we can program the words "the number 2 is blue" into a computer, and then that computer can grind out further conclusions or statements, that is, if it's programmed in the right way. To repeat, Wittgenstein didn't argue that such language games were bogus, or even that they have no value. Instead, he simply saw them as being part of particular technical systems. And from that, many other things followed. To sum up with specific reference to Gödel's ontological proof, the whole of Gödel's proof seems circular in that every term and argument relies on every other term and argument within the system. See circular reasoning. Thus, if you buy into one of Gödel's terms such as positive property or godlikeness, then all the other terms and conclusions seem to come along with it. This is Gödel's theological package deal. This is Gödel's ontological proof. Gödel's theological system? According to the German philosopher André Fuhrmann, theology is actually embedded in Gödel's logical proof. See here. Well, Gödel's axioms certainly include the words positive property, godlike, godlikeness, essence, etc. Thus, these terms certainly don't belong to either science or logic. Indeed, Gödel did take his axiomatic terms as primitives, perhaps equivalent to David Hilbert's point, line, plane, etc. Gödel's axiomatic terms, though not their logical treatment, are actually theological and aesthetic. Indeed, Gödel himself wrote, as quoted by Dr. Thomas Gorlick, "Positive means positive in the moral aesthetic sense." Of course, all these extra-logical terms and assumptions can still be treated logically, and Gödel did treat them logically. But, again, terms like positive property, godlike, essence, etc. don't belong to logic, even if they can be treated logically. To sum up, Gödel's proof may well work logically. It may even be logically flawless. However, it doesn't actually prove that God exists. Instead, it proves that if the axioms are taken to be true, then we must conclude that God exists. Conclusion, Gödel's 14 points. The extra-logical basis of Gödel's proof of God's existence can be seen in his 14 points. So perhaps the true axioms, even if that term is used loosely here, of Gödel's overall theological worldview can be found in this set of 14 points. 1. The world is rational. 2. Human reason can in principle be developed more highly through certain techniques. 3. There are systematic methods for the solution of all problems, also art, etc. 4. There are other worlds and rational beings of a different and higher kind.